I'm gonna, because of time restraints, I'm gonna stop the film there. Let me just get myself together here. Oops, there we are. I hope this is going to work. Dum 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 dum. Ah, yeah. I've always been a little bit jealous of stand-up comics and boxers who have rousing intro music before they take the stage, and never happens to an artist. So I thought today we'd have a little bit of rousing music accompanying the film. I'm just going to read a little bit that I sort of prepared. Normally I don't do that, but for the sake of trying to keep things fairly compact, I'll do that. I'm going to talk about a small number of works from a much larger body of such works that are fueled by the specifics of place or site. They are not works that are bound physically to those sites. They are therefore not site-specific in the traditional sense, but are rather free-roaming, autonomous works that exist as a result of an action or process made at or in light of the particular site in question. These places or sites, while occasionally chosen for me through invitations or commissions, become home to half-formed ideas and or narrative structures. They inhabit those ideas, flesh out those narrative structures with their specific geographies, histories, and ecologies. As places, they are invariably complex amalgams of political, social, historical, and ecological notions, places where it is hard to unpick those interwoven realms. Culture and nature become inseparable. In fact, nature seems an unproductive term here. They are often temporally complex too, anachronistic perhaps. They are often, in that they seem at once mired in the past and simultaneously prophetic or futuristic perhaps. As such, they often seem to promote anachronistic responses, works that push and pull at contemporary notions of time, slowing things down, redeploying redundant technologies or pre-existing artworks, or simply conflating the past and the present. Project for Rift Valley Crossing, of which we've just seen a few moments, is just such a response in just such a site, a deeply complex site with an intensely complex and divisive history. A fast disappearing and highly saline body of water at the lowest point on Earth, sandwiched between Israel, Jordan, and the occupied territories, a repository for vast mineral wealth, once fed by what was formerly one of the world's great waterways, the Jordan River, now a mere trickle, its fresh water diverted for intensive agriculture long before it reaches the Dead Sea. It is a dystopian vision, a long-term environmental degradation fueled by cultural history and politics. Its ever-expanding shoreline, now pitted with sinkholes that sporadically consume farms, roads, and buildings alike, as an environmentally stressed former seabed collapses in on itself. This microphone it sounds like it's coming in and out all the time. No? Okay. It is perhaps interesting to note that the abandoning of that attempted crossing of the decidedly modest-sized sea was not caused by the site's complex politics, by a military intervention, for example, but rather by the weather, an impending storm forcing us to return prematurely. However much we try to control things with science and technology, however creative we are, something bigger gets in the way. have to sort of apologize that in some way a lot of this material is probably quite familiar to certainly the art audience here today. But it seemed that this kind of, or this sort of strain of work within my practice that was the most appropriate in a way to talk about today in relation to the themes of the day. So I'm going to start by talking about, in a way, one of the first kind of more complex and ambitious projects that I realized sort of fairly soon after leaving art school. It's a project called Blue Boat Black that was realized in 1995. I moved to Glasgow to study in 1990 at the art school. And I arrived at a time when the city was kind of emerging as a kind of new center for contemporary art, and there was this kind of generation of artists who had decided to stay in the city and sort of make it something rather than, in many cases, the ambitious artists of the past would have left the city and gone to London or New York or wherever. But there was this sense of a very sort of proactive relation to notions of center and periphery and so on and so on, and this kind of hyper awareness of the geography of making, I suppose, and that's something that fed into my practice and sort of shaped, I think, the way that I still work today very much. This is an image of a studio that I had in a place called La Friche de la Belle de Mai, an old gitan cigarette factory that had been made into an art center. And I spent many happy months in Marseille building a fishing boat with the wood from a museum display case, which I'd brought with me from the National Museum of Scotland. And it actually ended up looking like this, a kind of rather handsome craft, I would say, with some sort of idiosyncratic details from its former life as a museum display case. And anyway, once my boat was complete, I went fishing. And yeah, talking of anachronisms, that's me as a much younger man trying to catch fish around Marseille, which is not an easy job. I eventually found a very cooperative painter who lived in the studio next to mine, and he would bring me special little boxes of worms that he knew were good for catching certain fish in certain parts of the coastline. So eventually I managed to catch a number of local species. And then the fish were initially frozen. And then the boat was taken to a charcoal burner and cut into some pieces and then turned into charcoal. And then we used some of the charcoal to cook the fish. And we had a modest meal with some friends, artists, on the roof of La Friche. And then the remains of the project were later presented, initially actually back in Scotland, in Glasgow, at Transmission Gallery. This image is from more recently, when the work was reshown in an exhibition in Nottingham. And the texts on the wall are also made with some of the charcoal, and of course are just the names of the fish that were caught. This is a project called Plant Room. A plant room, of course, is in a building is the room where you have all the machinery and you know, the electrical systems and the central heating and the air conditioning, all those kinds of things. It's, I suppose, one of, in a way, a very simple manifestation of a sort of site-fueled work. It was made in the Kunstraum Dornbirn in 2008, and the building is a slightly run-down former turbine factory. They used to make turbines for hydroelectric power there. And it's right next door to the Naturmuseum, which is a grander, more elaborate structure. When I went to visit the place for the first time, they said to me, you can do absolutely anything you like in this space, but you can't show archival material because we have no climate control. And of course, this was like a sort of red rag to a bull. And I immediately came up with this idea to make a climate control system to show some archival material. So that's what I did. And I worked with a wonderful architect called Martin Rauch, who he lives in the mountains not so far from Dornbirn and the western part of Austria. And he's been sort of reactivating and redeploying sort of traditional building technologies. And the building we developed was made from adobe mud bricks, which is a very good material for climate control. It was used, of course, for building buildings to store crops in the past. And the building was designed on a very simple, inverted kind of arch created by hanging a chain, a very simple way of defining a strong structure. And it had a sort of rather high-tech fuel cell-powered cooling, heating system, which was sort of plumbed into the mud brick walls in a sort of slightly interesting fashion. And then inside plant room there was a vitrine, and inside the vitrine were 8 vintage photographs by Karl Blossfeldt, the German photographer whose work is now in the collection of the UDK, where he worked in the Department of Decorative Arts. And they're extremely valuable things, and it was extremely kind and trusting of the UDK to lend me them for the exhibition. And we managed with this rather simple system, basically with earth and water, to create a climate that was acceptable to Blossfeldt's iconic images of plants. This is one of the images that we exhibited. I guess his images were made for decorative art students. So they were kind of models for making, you know, wrought iron decoration on balconies in Berlin and stuff like that. But of course subsequently have become very, very important in a sort of in the history of sort of new objectivity and that sort of strain of German photography. So they've been kind of co-opted into another discourse, I suppose, which they were never intended to function within. This is a rare inclusion of an unruly root in one of his photographs, which very rarely get into the image. I think he probably just never got around to cropping it or something. So, even though this plant room was a work that emerged from this very specific set of circumstances, and in a way could only have been made there, perhaps in Dornbirn, in this kind of unregulated climate, and was very much triggered by and inspired by that, I later sort of recycled the project for an exhibition in another unregulated space, which was the temporary Kunsthalle in Berlin, which was a sort of wooden box, which was built along Unter den Linden for a few years, and they ran a very sort of rigorous and interesting exhibition program there for a while. And I was invited to make a show, I kind of decided to combine Plant Room, this climate control system for showing photographs, with another work which has already been mentioned, Cactane House, which was originally made in 2003 for Porticus in Frankfurt, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But there's this, what I was trying to do was to create this kind of, almost like this kind of competition in a way, between these two projects. There was a kind of face-off between this heating system for keeping a cactus comfortable in cold Northern Europe, and this climate control system for showing photographs. This is actually, you can see Unter den Linden in the background there, and the old Volvo on a little platform, feeding cooling water and petrol and other things into the motor inside. The cactus for Cactane House came from, as was also described earlier, the Tabernas Desert in Spain, and it's basically the only desert the only true desert in Europe, and it's growing quite fast due to sort of poor land use and also climate change, of course. And it's become, it's a place that I've returned to many times. And I think because it's this kind of, it's a very heady mix of some quite interesting things that sort of coalesce there. One of them being this solar platform of Almeria, it's called, and it's a sort of experimental site for the use of solar power, particularly in the desalination of seawater for agriculture. Here's the agriculture, this extremely ugly and unsustainable plasticulture, which goes on all along that part of the Spanish coast, growing plants and vegetables and flowers for the Northern European market mostly, with groundwater which is fast running out. And then, of course, the kind of twist in the tale in the Tabernas Desert is the presence of the studios where spaghetti westerns have been made. When I was there, they were making a French advertising campaign, but it does occasionally get used for making feature films still. And of course, it's famous for Sergio Leone's films, A Fistful of Dollars, A Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is the backside of that. And this is the Cereus cactus, rather smaller than when it made it to Germany some years later. And I drove my big red Volvo to Spain and dug up the plant from the film sets, and then drove it 2,145 kilometers to Frankfurt, and then disemboweled the car and used the car to heat the space. In a way, I suppose Porticus is a kind of facade also. It was once a library that was bombed during the Second World War, and they stuck a very improvised sort of Portakabin structure on the back to make it into a gallery. So it's this kind of a rather nice space that you can sort of cut holes in and do stuff with in a kind of productive way. So the gallery assistant would get into the car in the morning and turn the engine on, and then the with the normal ignition, and then it would hum along and warm up the space. This is actually Chris Burden, the American artist, and it's a project, an image of a project he did in 1977 called the Death Valley Run, where he crossed Death Valley on a kind of very improvised moped built from a bicycle and a tiny petrol engine. It was the sort of inspiration for another of my projects at the Tabernas Desert, which came a little bit after Cacteen House. This is a improvised fuel cell powered moped that I built from a couple of bicycles and a fuel cell with hydrogen tanks to power a 900-watt electric motor that's on the back wheel. And I made a far less heroic crossing of the Tabernas Desert, which is not so intensely hot or scary as Death Valley, and not as big either. But we collected some water, which is the byproduct of the reaction between hydrogen and oxygen on a platinum catalyst inside the fuel cell. And then the water was used to make a kind of funky watercolor of a Cereus, not a Cereus, a Plioptunia cactus, which again I found in the desert. There's many of those in that part of the Tabernas Desert. And the two things are kind of exhibited in a sealed container. This is another work that kind of emerged from a very specific site, and actually an invitation to respond to a very specific site. It's a work called Island for Weeds. And it's one of a number of works that I made while I was living in Scotland, which are kind of concerned with introduced species in one way or another. I'm going to talk about another one of those briefly afterwards. And it's a kind of prototype for a floating island, which I was, to cut a slightly long story short, I was invited to make a proposal for an artwork for the new Scottish National Park. Scotland had never had its own national park before, and there was much celebration and hoo-ha about this. And they invited 7 artists to make proposals, and my proposal was accepted initially. And it was a very simple proposal to make a floating structure to float in amongst some other small islands on Loch Lomond, which is at the heart of the national park. All the islands have very beautiful little stories connected to them. There's one where there's supposedly a colony of wallabies that were bought by an eccentric landowner from Australia at some point. And there's another island that was used for drying out alcoholic monks as well. So I thought I would add one more of these kind of mythical islands to the... And I made this proposal for an island for weeds. And the star of the piece are these Rhododendron ponticum, which are, on the one hand, on every sort of picturesque calendar of Scotland with their beautiful blooms, but they're also a highly demonized plant. They were introduced in the 18th century into cultivation, but then they kind of hopped over the garden wall and escaped into the wilderness, and are now kind of hated by farm owners and landowners alike. We were just about to go into production of the full-sized island when there was a kind of scandal, and it was discovered that one of the funders of my project was Scottish National Heritage, who pay around about £5 million a year to farmers to destroy rhododendrons. And so they kind of figured that paying for my little island for weeds was going to sort of contradict this, and that there would be a sort of media outcry. And they pulled the plug on the project. But it kind of had a life. At that moment, I was invited to represent Scotland in the, which for an Englishman is quite an honor, in the Venice Biennale. And so we presented this prototype for Island for Weeds in this big long room of a palazzo overlooking the Grand Canal. So it had this kind of beautiful sort of homeless, longing quality to it in that context. How are we doing for time? Yeah, okay, I'll speed up. This is a sort of sketch I did at the beginning of a process which led to the making of a piece called Infestation Piece Muscled More. And again, it's about a kind of introduced species that came to North America at the end of the Cold War. This is the work actually getting hauled out of Lake Ontario after 18 months underwater. And it's a replica of a sculpture by Henry Moore, made in steel rather than bronze, because we discovered that zebra mussels, which we were interested in growing, were not too keen on bronze. And so we made a steel one instead. And we stuck it in the lake, and we grew zebra mussels. And the story of zebra mussels is that they came in the bilge water of ships, container ships from the Black Sea, when trade began between the former Soviet Union and North America. And now zebra mussels are everywhere in the water systems of North America, and they're a very voracious and successful introduced species. This is Henry Moore, the man in the middle there, with the director of the Art Gallery of Ontario. This was just when they bought the work. It was the first work of Moore's to be in a public collection in North America, and it was actually recommended to them by this man, Anthony Blunt, who was a very eminent historian who ran the Courtauld Institute in London and was the keeper of the Queen's pictures also. But he was also a spy who worked for the KGB. And somehow his connection to, I don't know, zebra mussels was irresistible to me. Yeah, this is an image that they made. They raised money to buy the sculpture by making adverts with a beer company, Molson Blue. And this is what triggered the whole project. I went to visit Ontario on a site visit for the Toronto on a site visit for the project, and came across this incredible bicycle, which is encrusted with zebra mussels. And they just fished it out of Lake Ontario, and it was there on the ferry. And so, yeah, that led to this kind of idea of copying the shielded warrior and throwing him into the Great Lakes for a while. This is the zebra mussel as scientists see him. And this is you can't see so well, this is the final work, which sat in a gallery overlooking the lake. The lake is just outside that window there. It's at the power plant in Toronto. It's called, Infestation Piece Muscled More. It actually got an infestation of moths recently when it was on display in a museum. The AGO bought the work, and then one of the guards saw a little creature crawling up it, and of course all hell let loose in the museum, and it went straight into quarantine. And so yeah, it's kind of has a certain drama to it. That's the backside. I don't know, how much time do I have? 5 minutes? No. Okay. I was gonna just show you this work, but I won't. It sort of has a nice, although it has a nice circularity in a way, because we started with this boat that was made from salt, that was extracted from water from the Dead Sea, magnesium canoe, and we end with an image of a boat which actually, I can do it very fast, kind of eats itself. It's called autoxylopyrocycloboros, and it takes the form of a slide piece. And it was made in Loch Long, where they keep the nuclear submarines in near Fastlane, and it was a kind of response to that place, I suppose, with these menacing, huge nuclear submarines passing by in these very, very deep waters. It was also the Clyde Estuary was the place where the steamship was invented. So my little steamship, kind of over a 4-hour trip, ate itself. It was called Dignity, which was rather beautiful too. Sorry, I'm rushing. That seems like a nice place to end. Thank you.